Ready? Hi everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Lahore Lit Fest 2022. It is fantastic to be here in person after such a long time. For me personally, not just after a pandemic, but also many of you will know that I used to live in Pakistan. I was part of the launch team for Dawn News and then a correspondent for CNN and Channel 4 here. And I've been involved with the Lit Fest since the very start, and it's celebrating its 10th year. But I return after an injury while on assignment, and I've been off for a number of years, so it's a personal pleasure for me as well to return. And thanks for so many of you coming to join us in person today, and many people online as well. Hello to you. For my part, my purpose, I feel, is always just as a guide to facilitate the conversation. I will try not to talk too much, but so that we really get to hear from our wonderful experts that the Lit Fest has organised for us today. So let's start with the magnificent Ambassador Maleeha Lodhi, who you can see on the big screen behind me. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to make it in person today. She is, of course, a Pakistani diplomat, former journalist like myself. She has served her country in many capitals around the world in key areas, so it's great to have her join us to talk about the state of global politics. And of course, she has a regular column in Dawn, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and if you're not, please do look it up. I'm also joined to my left by Professor Marc David Baer. He's an American-British historian. He's a professor at the International History at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and he is author of The Ottomans, which will also take centre stage later here at the Lit Fest, and he'll be signing books for you too. So we want to start with just giving the stage to both our experts here today. I'm going to give you both 5 minutes. I'm a stickler for time, so you'll get 5 minutes each, and then we want to try and facilitate a conversation encompassing so many things, which I'll mention shortly. Well, I'll do it now. What are we experiencing right now? The Ukraine war, Afghanistan, the fallout of that, the pandemic, a global inflation crisis, oil prices, Brexit, the rise of China, climate action, and of course, Pakistan's place in all of this. So, first of all, Ambassador Maleeha Lodhi, it's over to you for your opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Saima, and hello, Mark. I want to start by thanking LLF for inviting me, and of course, a big thank you to Razi, who makes this all possible. What an extraordinary effort he mounts every year, almost every year. So let me, in my brief opening remarks, just set the context for our discussion and flag a few points about the international environment. I think we are poised at a critical inflection point in history. The world is in the throes of one of contemporary history's most unsettled periods, with the rise of geopolitical tension. So, what are the 6 key features that I see in the international landscape? First, of course, the obvious one, a resurgence of East-West tensions. We see 2 Cold Wars, in fact, one, the ongoing one in Europe, in the crisis and the war over Ukraine, and then the other one, the US-China confrontation globally and, of course, in the South China Sea. Second, what we see in the world is increasing multipolarity as global power in the past decade or more has been diffused and redistributed in a world that is still very interconnected, where the notion and currency of power has also undergone a fundamental change. So we see the shift in economic power from the West to the rest. Third, we see the rise of right-wing populism, so-called strongmen, although I don't find them very strong, and extreme nationalism or hyper-nationalism in many parts of the world, and of course the increasing resort to unilateralism by their leaders. Now, it is also reflected in the effort by big powers and regional powers to rewrite the rules of the game in their own neighborhood. We see an example in our own neighborhood, which is Prime Minister Modi's actions in occupied Kashmir. And of course, we see the Russian military invasion of Ukraine. 4, we see threats to multilateralism an erosion of a rules-based international order as we knew it in the past 5 decades. And this is reflected in the way that agreements, treaties have been renounced from time to time or just flouted. So the net result is that the post-World War II multilateral system is under unprecedented stress. 5, we see heightened competition in the area of advanced technologies. In fact, this has become the new arena for competition between the big powers, and the tech wars that are taking place are in fact leading to the bifurcation of the digital world. So, we're seeing a China-led technological trend, and we're seeing a US-led technological trend. And the two are increasingly bifurcating. And then finally, of course, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the key areas that are structuring the international landscape. We see an anti-globalization sentiment sweeping much of the world, much of the Western world actually, and the adoption of protectionist policies, first by former President Trump, but also continuing by the United States in its competition, its rivalry with China. So I think the accepted international trading system that held sway for decades, it did face setbacks from the 2007 financial crisis and the trade war that was initiated between the US and China. But then the pandemic struck, and we saw disruptions to trade and travel, and of course we saw the intensification of the trade war. So, the consequence is that the world is probably likely to see, more rather than less restrictions on the movement of people, goods, and capital in what seems to be a reversal of many aspects of globalization. So let me round off this, sort of review or overview of the global environment by saying that at a time when global cooperation and international solidarity is most needed, it has been largely absent. And of course, this is graphically illustrated by the lack of a coordinated response during the 2 years plus of the COVID crisis. So the cooperation gap and the absence of global leadership has been telling. So with that, I'd better not violate the 5-minute rule that Saima has imposed and hand it back to you.
Thanks very much indeed. Professor Marc Baer.
Thank you. Well, Ambassador Lodhi has spelled it out in a brilliant way and given us a lot to think about. I would also add the environmental crisis is also something that we're facing. We're facing unprecedented floods, unprecedented fires, and when she speaks about the lack of international cooperation, this is exactly the problem. When we have leaders in some countries who even deny the environmental crisis, this is a time for multilateralism, for countries to come together to try to fight against what we've done to this planet and how we need to stop these changes. I want to speak very briefly about Ukraine. Now, Ukraine, this is a situation where a dictator has invaded a democracy, and it's not only a military invasion, but also the aim of Putin is to annihilate Ukraine, is to destroy Ukraine as an entity. So it's not simply a military invasion, but his purpose, and he spelled it out in something he wrote a year ago, is to actually make it so that Ukraine never exists again. So this is bigger than a military invasion. So this is one of the reasons why people in the West are so agitated, so upset about what's happening in Ukraine. And I was in India earlier in the week, and people there are saying, well, this is really, why should we be so upset about what's happening in Ukraine? Of course, it's a catastrophe for the people there. But isn't this just another case of just white people fighting white people? And when brown people suffer in the rest of the world, the West doesn't get so upset about it. So for example, in India, people were telling me about Tibet, how in the 1950s, what China did to Tibet is what Russia's doing to Ukraine today. So why doesn't the West care about Tibet? And of course, in this country, people are concerned about Kashmir, and they're right to be concerned about that. But I would say that It's not just a matter of a military invasion or white people killing white people. This should concern us all. Imagine if India were to attack Pakistan and say that Pakistan never existed, Pakistan is just part of India, and we're going to make that happen. And that's what Putin is doing in Ukraine. So just a little bit of detail to think about that.
You've stolen some of my questions from me. Thanks very much indeed, both of you, for that overview. I certainly learnt a lot from that. And of course, I've been covering all of these stories while reporting and presenting for Sky News in the past year. So let's start then with the most recent crisis that the world is experiencing, and that is Ukraine, of course. And it's always interesting as a journalist because, of course, when a new crisis happens, it seems that the other crises get wiped away and nobody hears anything about the others, but they are still rumbling on. And that's why I'm going to try and get to everything as much as we possibly can for you. So kicking off with Ukraine, Ambassador Lodhi, I want to ask you, there's been a lot of discussion and rhetoric in the United Kingdom about Putin going mad. Putin's been locked away during COVID for 2 years in a bunker, and he's finally gone mad. Surely Putin knows exactly what he's doing, and he is exploiting a situation where NATO allies and, as you say, global leaders are completely dysfunctional.
Well, I think there are two views, maybe more than two views, but one view, of course, is the one that you have indicated. The other is actually a question rather than a view, and then it leads to a view, which is, could this crisis have been averted if the United States and its allies had been responsive to Russian security concerns? After all, the crisis was preceded by very serious talks between the two countries. So would an offer of a moratorium on Ukraine's NATO membership have satisfied Moscow? I think the jury is out on that. It's hard for me to come down one side or the other, but I will say that there's a great deal of opinion in the West, and of course here as well, which argues that Russia could have been forced into taking this action, which doesn't make it right by any stretch of the imagination, and that Washington may have erred in encouraging the eastward enlargement of NATO in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War. Remember, and many people have pointed this out, the US had given Moscow assurances in the late 1990s, or in fact, in 1990, at the time of German reunification, that NATO would not expand eastwards. So this is apparently reflected in declassified documents as well, American and German. So, was this an unkept promise that fueled Russian grievances over the decades and led to this? Or was it what you are indicating, or what I had mentioned earlier, which is strong men who feel that they can, get away with impunity, because I personally feel what has happened in this case is obviously a violation of international law. A country that invades another country, is a violation of the UN Charter and international law. And as for, the West having much to answer for, as Mark was also just saying, he heard this opinion in India, and of course he will hear it in Pakistan also. I mean, I've always said two wrongs don't make a right. Yes, the West has much to answer for, but that doesn't mean that Putin should get a free pass. So I will leave it here and ask whether this was a strategic overreach by Putin, which will backfire very badly.
Thank you. Professor Baer, do you think that, first of all, I'd like to know how you think this will play out, and do you think that Putin will get the new global world order that he's seeking? I mean, he clearly wants a return to the glory days of the USSR, and he feels that now is the right time to do that. Do you think he'll achieve it? Will there be a new global order?
Well, like many people here, I visited the Soviet Union in the 80s, and it wasn't so glorious at the time. So he's maybe looking to, return to the Soviet Union of even in the 1930s. But the ambassador is right to point out the NATO problem. And I'm the first to say that when Germany was reunified in 1990, 1991, NATO should have disbanded. There's no question about that. NATO's purpose ended when the wall fell and the Warsaw Pact was disbanded. NATO should have gone then. That's absolutely true. But when we think about Putin, this isn't just about Ukraine. 20 years ago, he destroyed Chechnya. And at the time, the West cheered him on. Our own Prime Minister, Tony Blair, congratulated him for attacking Islamic terrorism. And we have to remember that. That was 20 years ago. That was 2000. And then in 2008, when there was a democratic uprising in Georgia, he crushed it, made sure that Georgia would not be part of the West. And then in 2000, since the Syrian civil war in 2011, of course, he rescued Bashar al-Assad. And look what's happened to the people of Syria. How many have become refugees? How many have been killed? So this isn't new. What happened in 2014? Crimea. Now, there are people who argue that it should have belonged to Russia, not Ukraine. That's a different issue. But in 2014, the people of Crimea did not want to be part of Russia. And so he invaded and annexed it. So from 2000 till today, Putin has been doing these things. It's not simply a matter of him going mad and because of COVID isolation.
I'm going to tag on a quick question then. It's interesting about what you just said about NATO being should have been disbanded, which is a controversial viewpoint, certainly where I come from in London and the conversations I'm having on air. And also the fact that Putin seems to be using the rhetoric of the West, right? Using excuses like weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons. It's almost like he's poking fun at, you've also done this, so why shouldn't I?
And he's also using the language of genocide, which he knows that in the West people are very sensitive to. And he knows that during the Bosnian Civil War, when Serbs were committing genocide, NATO bombed the Serbs. They also bombed the Chinese embassy, but that was something else, a warning. But so he's using this rhetoric of genocide to justify what he's doing. There is no genocide in eastern Ukraine.
Well, let's turn to, I mean, honestly, we could have a whole hour on Ukraine, couldn't we, and Russia, but let's turn then to Ukraine, Afghanistan rather. And of course, Afghanistan is a neighbor to Pakistan. Pakistan has been heavily involved and experienced the blowback of everything that happens in Afghanistan for decades. I want to turn to Ambassador Lodhi. How do you see this playing out? Afghanistan effectively abandoned yet again. Extreme poverty, famine, almost left in a far worse state than it was found when it was under the Taliban's rule.
Well, I think, as you rightly point out, Saima, Afghanistan faces huge challenges. There's the immediate, there's the urgent and the important. The urgent, of course, is the humanitarian crisis. But the important is whether the Taliban have learned from the past and are able to govern a country which has changed. This is 2022. I mean, this is not a time when they can apply the governance methods or techniques that they did when they were last in power, which is in the 1990s. So I think the key question is going to be whether the Taliban can stabilize their country in the long run. And of course, from Pakistan's point of view, we find our security inextricably linked to that in Afghanistan. And Pakistan remains concerned over the security threat posed by groups that are still residing in Afghanistan. As you know, the Taliban made many promises to Pakistan as well as the international community. And as you will also acknowledge, the Taliban have not been formally recognized by any country in the world, including Pakistan. So, I mean, and one of the reasons, in fact, the principal reason for that is that the international community, of which Pakistan is a part, would wish for the Taliban to live up to the promises they made, especially the promises they made in countering, containing, and dismantling terrorist groups that are still there.
And what about what
Go
about
ahead.
the ramifications for Pakistan in terms of the TTP, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan? There is a fear of a
exactly
resurgence.
what I was saying,
here.
yeah. Simon, that's exactly where I was leading to, that these groups, in the last several months, Pakistan has seen a resurgence of violence directed by the TTP from Afghanistan. So there have been, of course, quiet talks with the Afghan government, and the Taliban have given assurances, but we need to see these assurances concretize, translating into actual efforts to contain these groups and to dismantle them. So, I mean, I think this is a work in progress, but, you know, Afghanistan's stability is by no means assured as we look at the situation there. The economic crisis, the fact that the West is still not, I mean, the United States-led West, I should say, has still not fully accepted what happened in Kabul last August. So I think, you know, this is a very, very complex situation and poses many challenges. And I think, I mean, the biggest argument for the international community to engage with the Taliban, however unfavorably they may view them, is that this is a country where instability can have, once again, global ramifications.
Thank you. Mark, Afghanistan is, of course, infamous for being unconquerable, and history has shown us that there have been many invaders over the centuries who have failed to achieve what they wish to. Do you think global leaders will ever learn from the past and try and actually fix the wrongs that have happened in the past? Particularly Afghanistan is a case in point, right?
One of the most famous Orientalist British paintings that you can see at the Tate Gallery is actually a painting of the single surviving British soldier from a massacre in Afghanistan. It's in the 19th century. So have they learned? No, they haven't learned. So the British were defeated in Afghanistan. The Soviets intervened in the late 70s to prop up a Marxist leader, and then of course they were defeated. And then the British and the Americans were there for 20 years, and they of course were defeated and had to leave. So Afghanistan's crisis, Afghanistan's state is not going to be imposed by the West or by outsiders. It's not going to be solved by outsiders. But the situation, as the ambassador was saying, is very unstable. And we don't know how long the Taliban can last in power. There are other forces that are against them. What the outside powers can do is to try to help the humanitarian situation. And that could be that's all the outside powers should do. It is to help with the famine and the economic crisis, I think.
Well, let's take a look at the pandemic then. I mean, if you come to England, you'd think it's job done, pandemic's over, but in the same week as all restrictions being removed, we've also managed to hit the record highs of cases in the pandemic and a rise in hospitalizations as well. So that's a huge concern. We're very much still in the pandemic. And Ambassador Lodhi, you mentioned the almost dysfunction and inability of global leaders to respond to a global crisis with unity. One thing that in particular certainly bothered me and in all of the interviews that I was conducting was global vaccine inequity, which surely should have been top of the agenda.
Well, exactly, Saima. I think the lesson of the last 2 years was so, bleedingly obvious. It was that no one is protected until everyone is protected. But this was not a lesson that seems to have been absorbed by international leaders. So what we saw was a lack of global cooperation. We saw vaccine nationalism, and we saw vaccine inequities of the kind that you mentioned. Even now, as I speak, much of Africa is way behind in terms of vaccinating the majority of their population. Fortunately, Pakistan has done very well in vaccinating, I believe, upwards of 70% of our population. So I think, the pandemic didn't create this absence of global solidarity and cooperation. What it did was to reinforce a trend that was already there. And of course, we saw how the US and China, their standoff during this crisis, and then we saw how the US dealt with WHO. So, the lack of respect for global institutions, all of this, in a way, preceded the pandemic, but was further reinforced by the pandemic.
Professor Baer, you spoke about the fact that NATO should have been disbanded a long time ago. What about the United Nations? So many people often come up to me and say, well, what's the point of the UN?
That's a good question. We have to think about also the League of Nations also wasn't able to accomplish its goals. The United Nations also. But the question is, I don't think we should abolish it, but the question is, how could we make the UN effective? And currently having the Security Council made up of the victors of the Second World War isn't an effective way. Perhaps we should add India and Pakistan and Germany and other countries to an expanded Security Council. Then perhaps something would get done and remove the veto power. But about the pandemic, the ambassador is absolutely right to point out the lack of international cooperation, and you're also right to point out the inequalities in distribution. In Britain, they're offering the 4th vaccine to vulnerable people, which is fortunate for people. But then there are countries, as the ambassador pointed out, where people have, in Africa and elsewhere, where people, in South America, where people have had maybe 1 vaccine if they're lucky. So again, facing all these crises, the environmental crisis and health crisis, this is a time for multilateralism and not for these strong men who seek to go it alone.
Well, that neatly brings me on to China then, talking about strong men who want to go it alone. And also, Ambassador Lodhi, if you do want to say something as a former representative for Pakistan to the UN about the UN, feel free.
No, I think the UN is like a democracy. I mean, it's not perfect, but the other options are so bad that you have to stick to what you have and try to, as Mark said, to try to improve it. But I do want to make one quick point. The UN is seen through the prism of its responsibility to maintain peace and security. And in that, of course, it has been an abysmal failure, thanks to the constitution of the Security Council, which has the job of maintaining peace and security. It has not been able to avert major wars or conflicts. But if you look at the other side, the UN has done a remarkable job in the sphere of humanitarian relief, in the sphere of development. UNDP does a great job in Pakistan and elsewhere. So I think if we see the UN in its more comprehensive whole, it has been effective in certain areas, but of course in the area that Mark was talking about, it needs to really reinvent itself.
And then Xi Jinping, a very powerful leader. The rise of China is on everyone's lips, and it has been for some time, surely. CPAC in Pakistan, China, Russia, is that the new global world order? Are they really the new leaders to look for, or is the West still going to be a counterbalance to them?
No, I think China's rise has been extraordinary, and one that has huge admiration in Pakistan because of the way they lifted millions of people out of poverty. But I think if we look at the global environment, I think the most consequential relationship that is going to define the rest of the century, it seems, is going to be this confrontation, the tensions between the United States and China, which of course has a global fallout. It has an impact on virtually every country in the world, except if you're a remote island, I suppose. And for Pakistan, which has had traditionally good relations with the United States, and of course China has been its strategic priority for many, many decades, the last thing Pakistan would want to see is further turbulence in this relationship. So I would say that the US policy of seeking to contain China and being uncomfortable with the rise of a rival global power is something that they simply have to sit back and accept it and then see how best that they can manage this relationship rather than confront it. Because China's rise is continuing, and the sooner the United States comes to terms with it, I think it's important to sort of distinguish between other Western countries and the United States. I don't think the rest of the West necessarily follows the US in their engagement with China. Europe's largest trading partner now is China, not the United States. That in itself has certain obvious implications. So I'll hand it back to you with that.
Thank you. Professor Baer, of course, people would say that China didn't achieve what it's achieved and lifted people out of poverty without considerable human rights abuses. that we've seen play out in China, and of course issues, for example, the Uyghur population being persecuted there, and many others as well, Falun Gong, for example. But then there are other countries who are also guilty of human rights abuses. So where does the balance lie in addressing those issues?
Again, this is also some of the reasons some people are upset about all the attention on Ukraine, because of how China has been persecuting Muslims, the Uyghur population. And also think about what China has done to Hong Kong, and has gone back on all of its pledges to maintain democracy and a separate status of Hong Kong. Those are all gone. So of course there's rightful criticism of China. But the question that is on the mind of many people in the West is the question of Taiwan. So how will the leader of China see Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the response, and then how will he chart his own path to Taiwan? China, of course, doesn't recognize Taiwan as an independent republic, and its long-term plan is, of course, is to unify the island with the mainland. And the question is, for all of us, is whether China will do that by force or by negotiation. And we'll see how Ukraine plays out in the thinking of the Chinese leadership about that.
And the human rights abuse issue? I mean, is anyone ever going to be able to tackle that as far as China is concerned and the Uyghur population?
Well, again, countries act in their own national interests. So despite the human rights violations of Saudi Arabia, for example, which just executed 81 people in one afternoon, Boris Johnson was there to visit the next day to ask the Saudis to increase oil production, to replace Russian oil. So, it's funny. I mean, and also in Britain, we sell Saudi Arabia weapons, which Saudi Arabia uses to kill people in Yemen. Many civilians have been killed there. And Yemen is today facing one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, along with Afghanistan. So there's many places in the world where these are playing out. And again, states act in their own interest, and sometimes they voice concern for human rights, and other times they ignore them.
Precisely. I mean, one of the conversations on the radio, just as I was flying out to Pakistan in London, was, do we want cheap petrol so we can drive our kids to school, or should we care about 81 people being executed in Saudi Arabia? So that's the practicalities that politicians, populist politicians in particular, as Ambassador Lodhi mentioned, are trying to appeal to. I'm conscious of time because I also want to give people a chance for Q&As as well. So I'm going to ask you about Pakistan's place in all of this, Ambassador Lodhi. You have many contacts, you know what's going on behind the scene. I think certainly from the viewpoint in London, Prime Minister Imran Khan landing in Russia the night before the invasion of Ukraine was not a good look, to say the least. Was he doing the right thing?
I think it was important for Pakistan, once he had visited Russia, to then be very clear in where it stood on an issue of fundamental international law, which is if one country invades another, that, I'm afraid, in the 21st century is totally unacceptable. So I think the kind of anodyne statements that came out of Pakistan's foreign ministry, I certainly didn't agree with them, nor did I approve of them. I think it was important to take a principled position on this. And I've argued this in what I have written. I have said there is, here is a relationship with Russia which has no strategic content, which is still a work in progress. So why should Pakistan at least seem to be taking a position that is soft on Russia when it has invaded another country? As far as I'm concerned, I think it was important to mitigate the fallout of a visit and his meeting on the very day that Putin invaded Ukraine. But I didn't see that mitigation. And I hope in the days and weeks to come, Pakistan does take a more principled position on this issue, because it has implications for Pakistan's own, strategic objectives.
And Pakistan vis-a-vis China, Afghanistan, so much happening with the neighbors and
Well,
allies.
that is, well, I would say the four key areas that Pakistan has to navigate now. These are the four big challenges for Pakistan. One, of course, how to navigate through the confrontation ongoing between the United States and China, because Pakistan obviously wants to have good relations with both and doesn't want to get into the crosshairs of this standoff or this confrontation. The second is, of course, its troubled relationship with India and how to manage that relationship. Because right now it's in a state of no war, no peace, with the situation in occupied Kashmir hugely inflamed, and with Prime Minister Modi, given his recent electoral success, poised perhaps to continue to rule India. So how do we normalize a relationship with our neighbor when our neighbor is doing the sorts of things that are frankly unacceptable to Pakistan? And yet it's important to manage tensions. Afghanistan, we've, I think, already discussed. Pakistan faces, I think, there are security implications of what's happening there. And further instability in Afghanistan will obviously have a detrimental impact on Pakistan's stability. Then, of course, Pakistan has to very carefully balance between its traditionally strong and strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia and its relations with its neighbor, Iran. And it's a hopeful sign that there is some diffusion of tensions between those two countries, because that will help Pakistan also, which has always advocated dialogue between those two countries. Plus, I think the prospects of the Iran-West nuclear deal being concluded, I think, again, is very positive. Pakistan would welcome it, because the last thing Pakistan wants to see is another conflict by anyone in our neighborhood.
There tends to be a tendency with Pakistan to often talk about where it's placed strategically in terms of global geographical positioning. But looking internally as well, of course, Pakistan has many challenges still in its 75 young years. Poverty, clean drinking water, education. What's Pakistan doing on that path to rising and bettering itself?
Well, I think most governments, both civilian and military, have tended to get into crisis management mode rather than think long-term and deal with the structural sources of Pakistan's problems. Take the economy, for example. The economy has always been managed since the 1980s in a band-aid way. So you borrow, you get IMF bailouts, but essentially you rely on outsiders to bail you out, but you do not deal with the structural problems, which is that the country or the government simply lives beyond its means and is unable to raise resources and taxation. So I think, we need at least the leadership to seize this moment. I mean, we have Pakistan's National Day coming up next week. I think this should be a moment of deep reflection by our leaders and also a commitment to taking a long-term view rather than a view which sort of is based really on their own narrow political interests. And yes, Saima, the education deficit haunts Pakistan. And yet education, investment in education is the key to unlocking just about every problem that Pakistan faces, whether it's one of extremism, economic development, international competitiveness. So this is important. Then population growth. This is hardly talked about or discussed, and certainly there is no policy that I know of to effectively, of population management. We are growing faster than any other country in the region other than Afghanistan. And this has great implications for Pakistan's long-term security and economic prosperity, because unless we're able to educate these people and find them jobs, I'm afraid a demographic opportunity will turn into a demographic disaster.
Yeah, that's a controversial subject in Pakistan, isn't it? Professor Baer, you mentioned right at the beginning in your overview looking at the state of global politics at the moment, climate change. I often refer to climate action because I think we need to move on from the conversation of climate change. Pakistan, of course, one of the least polluters globally, and yet will be one of the worst hit by climate action and is being so already. It's happening in real time, right? Where is Pakistan positioned, and what can be done as far as climate action is concerned?
Well, I think
big question there.
It's a big question, and I'm not going to speak directly about Pakistan, but I think in our country, in Britain, I think we need to have politicians who take the environment seriously. But of course, we have a first-past-the-post system, and so we only have one Green Party member in our parliament. So that the question is that the other two parties then are going to have to act swiftly and seriously about these issues. You know, in this part of the world, there's very little rainfall in the cities of India and Pakistan, in this area, in this part. And then the rainfall, so a city like Jaipur in India, I found out, gets 35 days of rain a year. London gets 180, right? And so 35 days of rain, but then there's no forest, there's nowhere to trap that rain. And if the environment increases, you know, if the temperature increases just 1 degree, then there'll be even a worse situation. And it, you know, it's just going to be catastrophic if we don't make these changes.
It's actually the global north that really needs to address and tackle climate action, because here there is the 1 billion tree tsunami project that Prime Minister Imran Khan launched, but actually it's not these countries that need to do the hard work, right? Right.
No, it's the United States and Western Europe that have to find, you know, move away from coal. They've moved away from coal, but even, you know, they need to move more towards renewable energy sources.
Yeah, find sustainable solutions for the future. Right, so we have just under 15 minutes left, so I think it's a good time to hand over to our audience and have some participation. And if anyone has any questions, could you raise your hand, and I will try and see you and be on the light. Okay, there is one in the front row here. Do we have a mic, please? Right, just bear with us until you get a mic so we can all hear you.
Do you want to take several questions at a time?
Yeah.
And then answer?
Yeah, okay, what we're going to do is we'll take 2 or 3 questions in a row, and then we'll get them answered for you. Can you say your name, where you're from, and your question?
Hi, Saima.
Hi, Saad.
This is Saad Shafkat. A wonderful session, very thought-provoking, very analytical, and 2 tremendous experts. I had a question for Ambassador Lodhi, but I would also appreciate Professor Baer commenting on it. You know, we've discussed many important topics that are bothering the world or that are the focus of the world today, but one thing that we did not touch upon is Israel. And Israel, I mean, it's excuse me, it's been a cornerstone of our foreign policy, the non-recognition of Israel. And yet, the Middle East, whom we value a lot, who is very close to us, and especially Saudi Arabia and UAE, 2 very important monarchies that are very influential with Pakistan, they are cozying up to Israel. And so my question, just as, you know, as a layperson, trying to look at the way the world is getting organized or reorganized, my question is, how does Pakistan deal with this? And firstly, actually, why are the Middle Eastern monarchies even cozying up to Israel? And then what is Pakistan's place?
Thank you. There was a gentleman with his hand up right behind you, if you could pass him the mic. Thank you. Anyone else? Raise your hands.
Urdu mein kar lu?
Ji, मैं translate कर दूँगी. Ambassador Lodhi will understand.
इरफान जीरो, मैं जियो न्यूज़ में सीनियर रिपोर्टर हूँ. डॉक्टर साहब, आपसे पूछना है कि जब इमरान खान अमेरिका गए थे, उसके बाद आपकी छुट्टी करा दी गई थी, तो क्या कोई इख्तिलाफ राय था, आपकी परफॉर्मेंस अच्छी नहीं थी, या आपने प्रोटोकॉल नहीं दिया था?
Okay, thank you. ये प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस नहीं है, ये लाहौर लिटरेरी फेस्टिवल है. Okay, anyone else? Oh, okay. You've got the mic. It's you.
Hello, I'm Dr. Shahzad. One point, as David says, isn't this going to be an encouragement for China to march on to
Sorry,
Taiwan?
can you speak right into the mic?
Isn't this going to be an encouragement for China to march on to Taiwan? Isn't the Western hypocrisy and impotence being very, very clearly shown? Isn't the world has gone into a topsy-turvy situation? And isn't the nuclear disarmament has become the most pressing time? Any mischief, any blunder could be devastating. Nobody's thinking on that.
Nuclear disarmament. Thank you. Anyone else? Do we have any women with some hands up? I want some women asking questions as well. Bit of equality in the room.
Men still raise their hand when you say women.
Sorry?
Men still raise their hand when you say women.
Anyone else?
Assalamu alaikum.
Okay, there's a lady right at the front here. Can we pass her the mic, please?
Assalamu alaikum. This is Fad from Lums. Ma'am, I have a question from Ms. Maleeha, that what do you think, what is the pragmatic solution for the Kashmir issue? And do we have right now proactive diplomacy or reactive diplomacy?
Okay, thank you. Pragmatic solution for Kashmir. We'll be here for 2 hours, I think. Can I have the mic up for the lady at the front, please? You can try and shout. I can barely hear you. Do mic nahi the? Chalo inko de dein. Thank you.
My name is Rabia Fida. Sitting through the session, you know, one thing came across very strongly, which is that this whole trend that we often discuss, and today was very, you know, poignantly discussed as well, the rise of the nationalism, hyper-nationalism, and so on, unilateralism, lack of global coordination. Have we come to a junction in world history where the way international treaties and international law have been written are no longer serving, you know, the purposes and the challenges that they were meant to address? And what, as a diplomat, maybe the ambassador can answer this, what are some of the things that are leading to a failure in dialogue and deliberation and discourse between world leaders at the end of the day?
Thank you. All right, because we only have 10 minutes left, I'm going to crack on. So the UAE recognizing Israel, Ambassador Lodhi, and should Pakistan join in, and why is this all happening?
I think Pakistan's position has been a principled one. And remember, the implications of Pakistan recognizing an occupied territory, it has immediate implications for occupied Kashmir. So it's very easy to say that Pakistan should join, but Pakistan has to review the whole gamut of what it would mean for its own position on occupied Kashmir. So, you know, we have always said that we believe in a two-state solution, provided Israel accepts a contiguous, independent, genuinely independent Palestinian state based on the pre-1967 borders. So until and unless that happens, and the OIC collectively takes a decision, I do not see my country moving ahead on this. And frankly, I don't think Pakistan has anything to gain, to be honest with you. I can't think of a single strategic advantage that Pakistan might derive. Now, if certain Arab countries are doing it because they see it in their interest, well and good. Plus, I'd like to see which leader will get up in my country where public opinion would militate so strongly, because please don't underestimate the emotional attachment of the people of Pakistan to the issue of occupied Palestine.
So how is it possible that the UAE has done this then, and what are the advantages for the UAE? I think that Saad was asking that as well, right? Yes.
I mean, that is a question only UAE can answer. I can't answer on behalf of another country.
Well, it has to do with Iran, of course. And so they can, you know, Israel is selling a lot of weapons to the UAE, including, you know, getting fighter jets from the United States. So it's about containing Iran from their point of view.
Thank you. Nuclear disarmament, Professor Baer? Why is nobody talking about this?
Because it's so 80s, right? So, you know, it's been forgotten. But the gentleman is absolutely right. And when we have India and Pakistan and China and Russia and the US, all the nuclear powers, and perhaps Iran, perhaps Israel, it's a very dangerous world. I wish we could kick that off more, of course. It's a multilateral issue that should be, along with the environment, probably the second most important issue that should be addressed at the moment.
Of course, the problem is, though, that Ukraine did give up its nuclear weapons and was told that it would then be protected, and we're in the situation it's in today.
The Russians did.
Right,
so
exactly.
That's part of the problem.
Exactly, and so that leads to kind of, I think it's Rabia at the front, your question about international treaties not holding their worth and merit, and also why is there such a phenomenal failure of dialogue? Which one of you would like to answer that? Ambassador Lodhi?
I think the failure of dialogue is, you know, it's symptomatic of the kind of geopolitical tensions that we're seeing today, the rivalries, the competition, the confrontation. So it's very easy to point to the failure of the UN, for example. I mean, the UN as a multilateral institution, or indeed any other multilateral institution, is going to be as strong or as weak as its member states want it to be. So, many times one hears UN has failed. Well, actually, it's not the UN that's failed. It's the big powers in the UN that have made the UN fail. So I think we need to keep that in view. But I do think that the international norm that has been established, despite the fact that President Putin has flouted it, and others have in the past also, the invasion of Iraq on the basis of non-existing weapons of mass destruction. I mean, there are so many examples that one can give. But the norm is that military interventions in other countries is unacceptable and is a violation of international law. And that hasn't changed. Now, if there are leaders who flout it, I think the important thing is that they should then face international opprobrium. They should face the kind of sanctions that we see now being imposed. And I think one of the points I will make is that, the West surprised us, to be honest. We thought the West would not be so united in imposing the sanctions that it has done on Ukraine, on the issue of Ukraine, not on Ukraine, but on Russia. So, and of course, I know, Saima, that we might spend a little bit of time talking about the economic fallout, which is global, of the Ukraine war. So, there are many countries that have sort of felt that, well, this is a war in the heart of Europe. It's all about, as Marc was saying, I'll borrow the term that he uses, about white people. I mean, you were quoting somebody saying that, but the thing is that it's going to have a fallout on developing countries. The price of oil, the availability of wheat, grain shortages, inflationary trends being reinforced, strengthened, intensified by this war. So this is a war really with global ramifications.
Yeah, and of course that was already a problem with the pandemic as well, right? So this is just getting worse and worse. So we are at a Lit Fest, so before we wrap up, I want to ask both of you, what are the books you've been reading and what would you recommend everyone in the audience to read if they are interested in the state of global politics? Professor Baer first.
Well, I recommend everyone should go and visit the books store here and pick up the novels written by the novelists that are here, the Pakistani and also international novelists that are here presenting this weekend. You can even get a signed copy from these people, and you can ask them about the writing process. So it's a blank, it's a global statement, but certainly visit the books booth and buy the novels, read the novels that are written by these authors.
Thank you. Professor Lodhi?
I think, Saima, a book that will be launched or relaunched tomorrow, which really tracks what happened in Afghanistan and the relationship between Pakistan and the US by Zahid Hussain. I would say those who haven't read it should absolutely pick up a copy. And I hope Zahid is going to, I'm going to get a little fee for giving him this plug at the session. But yeah. I also think Fareed Zakria's book on the pandemic is a very thoughtful one. I mean, it was written about a year ago, I think, but it still has some very thoughtful ideas. And then, again, if we look at the latest books on Pakistan, I think Dr. Mohammad Wasim's book, Political Conflict in Pakistan, a very dense book, and yet a book with huge insights. And one of the insights, and I'll leave it there, I don't want to sort of relate what his argument is he actually examines why conspiracy theories and this sort of obsessive concern with somebody always out to get us is so deeply embedded in the educated middle class in Pakistan. Thank you.
I like that as an ending. I wanted to carry on talking to you about that. We'll get another hour for that another time. And of course, Zahid Hussain is speaking here. And we'll have the launch of the Ottomans as well. Thanks very much indeed to Ambassador Maleeha Lodhi and Professor David Baer. And thanks to our audience as well. I'm sorry we couldn't have more time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Well done. That was fun.
Well, it was. We wrapped